I promise you that when Joe Biden does go, when Joe Biden passes away, hopefully many moons from now, I won't lie to you about his presidency. I'm not going to lie to you about what the last 4 years have really been like. And this notion that time heals all wounds is just wrong. Time does not heal all wounds. And when Joe does go, I'm sure you'll hear platitudes about his time as vice president, his time in the Senate. But Joe Biden will ultimately be judged for what he did when he had the biggest job in the land, and that was President of the United States. And that job, no matter what you read in the New York Times or the Washington Post over the next 3 weeks, at that one job, Joe Biden has been a complete failure. And Jimmy Carter, our 39th president, and the man to whom Joe Biden is compared the most, lived long enough to witness a president that was worse than him, although not by much. Jimmy Carter was by all measures a good man, but Jimmy Carter was a bad president. A good man, but a bad president. But for the last day, every time I hear someone in the media talking about him, they're leaving out the most important part of his life, the 4 years that he was actually president. Yes, Jimmy Carter built homes for Habitat for Humanity. That's wonderful, truly. Yes, he was married to the same woman for 77 years. And yes, he won the Nobel Peace Prize. Jimmy Carter was a good man, but he was not a good president. And just like Joe Biden, history will judge him for that more than anything else. Because there are a lot of good people out there, and they don't get any attention at all when they die. But Jimmy Carter was president, so it's different. The other part of this story, Jimmy Carter had a long time to shape his legacy. He lived to be 100 years old. His post-presidency was longer than any other president in U.S. history. Jimmy Carter had 43 years to make up for the 4 years that he was in the White House. To put that into perspective, John F. Kennedy was 43 when he was elected president, and Carter was already in the Georgia State Senate at that time. 43 years is a very long time for people to change the way they feel about someone. But for an entire generation of Americans like my parents, their worldview was shaped by a man that didn't understand them at all. And just like Joe Biden, on Election Day in 1980, when Reagan beat Carter, mortgage rates were at almost 15% on a 30-year mortgage. And I'm sure that people watching at home right now remember that. They remember those days. My parents bought their first home when Jimmy Carter was president, and they always tell me how high the mortgage rate was. Yes, Jimmy Carter had a remarkable post-presidency, but generally speaking, if you're only hearing about the before and the after, the in the middle probably wasn't that great, and that's Jimmy Carter. How about John Quincy Adams? He also had a remarkable post-presidency. He's the only president in history to leave the White House and then run for Congress, where he fought against slavery for 17 years. He died in the U.S. Capitol building of a hemorrhage. And like Carter, he probably got a lot more done as a congressman in his post-presidency than as president. And just like Jimmy Carter and Joe Biden, a charismatic, populist candidate would beat him 4 years later. With John Adams, it was Andrew Jackson. Trump hung his portrait in the Oval Office. With Carter, it was Ronald Reagan. And with Biden, well, we all know what happened last month. It, of course, was Donald Trump. In 1976, and not surprisingly, then Senator Joe Biden was the first U.S. senator to endorse Jimmy Carter for president. And when Biden got the news that Carter passed away, Biden, as always, chose to mark the occasion from St. Croix by talking about his own loss, not once, but twice.
Our son Bo died. When he died, Jimmy and Rosa were there to help us heal. Jimmy knew the ravage of the disease too well, but he was also he and Rosa were very kind to Jill and me when we lost our son Bo. They were there for us.
That guy's still president for at least another 3 weeks. It turns out that Carter and Biden have a whole lot in common. Jimmy Carter left office with a 34% approval rating, the same approval rating that Joe Biden has today. Average inflation under Carter was 9.9%. Average inflation under Joe Biden was the highest of any president since, you guessed it, Jimmy Carter. Again, a good man, but a bad president. Although Joe Biden did seem to grasp one area where they have absolutely nothing in common. Joe Biden seemed to recognize yesterday that Jimmy Carter was a good and decent man.
Sir, what is your fondest memory of Jimmy Carter?
I have a number of them. I guess maybe my fondest memory of Jimmy Carter was when he he grabbed me by the arm and said, I need you to help me in my campaign. And I said, I've only been around a couple years, Mr. Governor. He said, no, it'll make a difference. I said, I'm not sure it will. He said, no, it will. When I endorsed him for president, I told him why I was endorsing him, and that it was not only his policies, but his character, his decency.
Decency, that is something that Joe Biden is not and will never be. Joe Biden still has a granddaughter that lives in Arkansas that he's never met or spoken to. Joe Biden is not a decent man. We know that. And when Joe Biden does die, that will be part of his story. Joe Biden's not going to have 43 years to try and shape public opinion, although I'm not sure that's what Carter was doing. But like Carter did, Carter was also a man of great faith. And I always admired that about him. His Secret Service code name was Deacon, appropriately. Donald Trump posted yesterday that Carter was a truly good man, and of course, he will be greatly missed. He was also very consequential, far more than most presidents after he left office. Warmest condolences to his wonderful family. Kind words from Donald Trump, considering that Jimmy Carter said this about Donald Trump not that long ago.
There's no doubt that the Russians did interfere in the election, and I think the interference, although not yet quantified, if fully investigated, would show that Trump didn't actually win the election in 2016. He lost the election, and he was put into office because the Russians interfered on his behalf.
Carter said that while Donald Trump was still president. And as I was putting this together today with my team, I wanted you to have an honest look at someone that, just like all of us, was flawed. I didn't want you to have the CNN or MSNBC version that I've witnessed over the last day. All day, they've covered this story like George Washington died. Literally, that's what it's been like. Again, Jimmy Carter, good man, awful president. And when he lost in 1980, a Democrat wouldn't win the White House for another 12 years. And if Ross Perot didn't come along, George H.W. Bush probably would have won again in 1992. In fact, Jimmy Carter's 4 years in office was the only 4-year period for a Democrat in the White House in a 25-year period. Nixon, Ford, Jimmy Carter, Reagan twice, then George H.W. Bush. And just like Joe Biden, when he ran for re-election, a Kennedy, a Democrat from his own party, this time Ted Kennedy, would run against him. Jimmy Carter was the first president ever born in a hospital and the last of the Second World War presidents. He was also the first president to serve grits in the White House. My wife went to school in Georgia. I always thought that was interesting. Carter gave 3 inaugural addresses during the 70s, 2 in Georgia and then, of course, 1 in Washington. Jimmy Carter created the Department of Education. Donald Trump wants to shut it down. After 75 years under U.S. control, Jimmy Carter gave the Panama Canal back to Panama for nothing. Donald Trump wants it back. In 1976, Jimmy Carter beat Gerald Ford by just 57 electoral votes, not a lot. And at first, this sort of Carterism appealed to a lot of Americans after going through Vietnam and Watergate. Americans wanted change, but they didn't want to be told to put on a sweater in the winter if it was cold and they were inside their own house. Take a look.
All of us must learn to waste less energy. Simply by keeping our thermostats, for instance, at 65 degrees in the daytime and 55 degrees at night, we could save half the current shortage of natural gas. There's no way that I or anyone else in the government can solve our energy problems if you are not willing to help.
That speech became famous, known as the Jimmy Carter sweater speech. He had that yellow cardigan on. Again, Carter, a fine man, not a good president. And just like Joe Biden, who sat back and watched as Russia invaded Ukraine. In 1979, Russia, then the Soviet Union, invaded Afghanistan. They stayed there for more than 10 years. And just like Joe Biden in Gaza, where Americans are still being held hostage right now, Jimmy Carter dealt with a hostage crisis that likely ended his presidency. The only difference between today and 40 years ago, the media back then was a lot more honest. And every night, they reminded the American people about what was really going on in Iran.
Some 60 Americans, including our fellow citizen whom you just saw bound and blindfolded, are now beginning their 6th day of captivity.
In Iran, on this 76th day of the hostage crisis.
Day 142 of the Iran hostage crisis.
This 152nd day of the hostage crisis.
This is the story of 444 days that changed the course of history.
You might remember that the Iranian hostage crisis would last for 444 days and ended on Ronald Reagan's first day in office. And just like Joe Biden, Jimmy Carter had members of his family using his name to make money overseas. Jimmy Carter had a little brother named Billy. You might remember Billy Beer. He found a way to make money in Libya, and Billy wasn't a real worldly guy. He did this all when Jimmy was president. The Libyan government ended up paying Billy over $200,000, millions in today's money, and I swear you can't make this stuff up. When a Senate committee was put together to investigate Jimmy and Billy Carter, guess who was on that committee? Right there on page number 2, Senator Joe Biden of Delaware. Yes, Jimmy Carter lived an amazing life, a long life. He never sat back and rested on his laurels. Born in 1924, I heard today on a Newsmax podcast that during his first 11 years of life, Babe Ruth, who was still in the major leagues, hit 430 home runs. Jimmy Carter, most certainly a good man, but a very bad president.
Information. Truth is freedom. Is Newsmax. It's real news for real people.